Hi, I'm Corey Goldberg and I'm in San Francisco, California, one of the most photogenic cities in the entire world. Fedot.com is the new generation of online photography classes that allows students to study at their own pace while perfecting their photography skills. Fedot's courses cover an extensive amount of theory with practical assignments to build solid photographic skills. In today's lesson in the basics of digital photography, we'll talk about one of the most common and yet complex genres in photography, the portrait. Let's explore some of the technical and artistic ways of making a beautiful photograph of someone. Each lesson in the course has a theory section, as well as exciting assignments to test your skills, with coaches available to help you create the best images that you can create. On the technical side, there are the usual exposure components: ISO, shutter speed, and aperture. Let's look at aperture first. It's common practice when creating a portrait to use a large aperture which will give a shallow depth of field. Just make sure that your camera's focus locks onto your subject's face. By blurring the background with a wide aperture, we draw more attention to the person in the photo. To enhance this effect, you can step back from the subject, zoom in, and make sure that your subject isn't too close to the background. However, if the background is interesting or beautiful, you may want to use a smaller aperture to increase your depth of field. So what about shutter speed? Our goal here is simply to ensure a sharp image. If our subject is still, we're going to need a fast enough shutter speed to compensate for the fact that our hands are not as steady as a tripod. The rule of thumb for shutter speed when hand-holding is 1 over the focal length of the lens. So for instance, if I'm using a 100mm lens, I'm going to want a shutter speed of at least 1/100th of a second, if not higher. Generally speaking, when shooting portraiture, you want to have a nice fast shutter speed like a 250th of a second or above. This will ensure that your subject remains nice and sharp, even if it's moving. The third element of exposure is ISO. Now remember, because of the issue of digital noise, we want to try and keep our ISO nice and low while at the same time maintaining our desired aperture and shutter speed. So if I'm shooting with a wide aperture, I can increase my shutter speed and at the same time keep a low ISO. Okay, so we've covered the technical side. Our camera settings are ready to go. So now we've got a couple of artistic decisions to make. First of all, how are we going to frame the photograph? So now if I just show her face, it's a great way to convey the emotion and the personality of the subject. In fact, this way it's really just about the subject. It doesn't reveal very much about the environment at all. Okay, so now if we step back or zoom out a little bit and include more of the figure, it reveals a little bit more about the posture and the movement of the subject, and reveals a little bit more about the location. Okay, Tatiana, step back just a few steps. Great. So now when we include the whole body, it becomes an environmental portrait. It's an image of Tatiana in her world. So we've decided how much of our subject to keep in the frame, but where should we put her? While certain rules are meant to be broken, there are a couple of guidelines to follow for some pleasing composition in portraiture. For a medium to wide shot where we see more than just her face, generally you want to keep the subject out of the center of the frame. It's a little more interesting if you have the subject on one side or the other. If the subject is looking in one direction or another, the composition usually feels a little better if you leave some space in the direction that the model is looking. What about vertical versus horizontal? Well, generally, a portrait of a single person fits better in a vertical orientation. However, it depends on how much of the scene you'd like to include in the frame. Part of the beauty of shooting digital is that it's essentially free to take more images. When it comes to shooting portraiture and most subjects, I recommend trying vertical and horizontal. You can always delete them afterwards. It goes without saying that lighting is important in photography, and it's perhaps most important when it comes to portraiture. So, how do we learn to read good light? If the face is the most important thing in the photograph, then it's important to keep moving the subject until you find the most flattering light. The best place for a portrait is in the shade, just out of the direct sun. It creates flattering light across the face and bright catchlights in the eyes. And remember, you can always use your camera's flash to fill in hard shadows. Portraits can be both the most difficult and rewarding images you create. Practice often, and don't forget, you can always use your camera's timer to create self-portraits. Okay, so now you're ready to take your own photographs from the assignment in this lesson. Remember to click through the feed to check out other student work for some inspiration. Happy shooting!